Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle a really brutal and honestly a very difficult chapter of the Spanish Civil War. We're looking at the wave of violence that just ripped through Republican-held territory. And really, this question gets right to the heart of what happened in Spain back in the 1930s. You know, that extreme political divide during the Second Republic. It wasn't just about arguments and debates. It literally exploded into violence. We're talking about neighbors, politicians, and, as we'll see, especially the church becoming targets. So, to really get a grip on this period, we've got to start with the basics. What exactly was the Red Terror? Let's define the term.
All right, so the Red Terror, or Terror Rojo. Now, this name itself has a history. It wasn't invented in Spain. It actually comes from the French and Russian revolutions. But, and this is key, it was picked up and used very effectively by General Franco's nationalist propaganda machine. They used it to paint a very specific picture, that the violence on the other side was this organized communist plot to destroy Spanish society and religion.
The sheer scale of the violence aimed at the Catholic Church was, well, it's staggering. Landowners and conservative politicians were definitely targeted too, no question. But the clergy? They bore the absolute brunt of it. This number, 6,832, isn't just a statistic. It points to what looks like a systematic attempt to just rip out a cornerstone of traditional Spanish life. And when you look at the breakdown, it's pretty clear this wasn't random at all. The violence hit every single level of the church's hierarchy. You're looking at thousands of parish priests and monks, hundreds of nuns, and even 13 bishops. It's said that many of them knew the danger they were in, but chose to stay with their communities anyway. So the big question is, how many people actually died? The honest answer? We'll probably never know the exact number. I mean, just look at the range here. Respected historians give estimates that go from under 50,000 all the way up to over 100,000. That massive gap tells you everything you need to know about the chaos of the war, how many records were lost or destroyed, and frankly, how politically charged this history still is today. Okay, so how on earth did things get so bad? How did Spain get to this brutal, violent breaking point? Well, this didn't just happen overnight. The violence didn't come from nowhere. You have to see the years leading up to the war as a kind of political powder keg, just sitting there, waiting for a spark. It all really started to build in 1931. The Second Republic is established, but its constitution is fiercely anti-clerical. It even banned religious orders from teaching. Then you have these flashpoints, like the Asturias Miners' Revolt in 1934. You could almost call it a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. 37 priests were killed, dozens of churches destroyed. And then, in 1936, the left-wing Popular Front wins this really polarizing, super controversial election. That was the final spark. And look, this wasn't just a conservative talking point. Even people who strongly supported the Republic, famous thinkers like the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, were sounding the alarm. He basically said that the Constitution's hostility towards the church was a huge, huge mistake. It pushed away a massive part of the population and, in his view, pretty much doomed the whole democratic experiment right from the get-go. So then we get to July 1936, and the military coup kicks off the Civil War. In a lot of Republican-held areas, the government and the rule of law just collapsed. And in that power vacuum, all those years of pent-up anger, all that political hatred, it all just exploded. A terrifying wave of violence was unleashed, especially in that first summer of the war. And it's so important to understand, this wasn't just about killing your political enemies. The violence was deeply, deeply symbolic. You see churches being burned and desecrated, priests and nuns hunted down specifically because of their faith. Take a place like the Diocese of Barbastro, an unbelievable 88% of their priests were killed. And there are these awful accounts of public humiliation, even mock crucifixions, things designed not just to kill, but to terrify, to completely erase the church's influence. The sheer pace of the killings is almost impossible to wrap your head around. I mean, just think about it. At its peak, in August 1936 alone, more than 70 members of the clergy were being killed every single day. It was this frenzied, explosive storm of terror, and it really showed how completely the Republican government had lost control. But here's the thing. Not all of this violence was spontaneous chaos. In fact, some of it was terrifyingly organized. And maybe the most infamous example of this is the Paracuelos massacres, which happened just outside of Madrid in the fall of 1936. This was a process known as the sacas, which means takings or extractions, and it was chillingly bureaucratic. Here's how it worked. Lists were drawn up of prisoners. We're talking military officers, political rivals, clergy, anyone deemed an enemy. They were told they were being transferred or even released with official-looking paperwork and everything. Then they were loaded onto buses, driven out of Madrid, and just systematically executed. We know at least 4,500 people were murdered like this. And this, of course, brings us to the huge ongoing debate about who was responsible. Right at the center of it all is a man named Santiago Carrillo. He was the young communist official in charge of public order for Madrid at the time. Now, for the rest of his life, Carrillo insisted he was innocent, that he had no idea these transfers were actually death sentences. But his critics, they point out that the man who signed the execution orders was his direct subordinate. The problem is, key documents were destroyed, so the debate just rages on, and honestly, it might be one of those historical questions we never fully answer.
So after the war, the fighting might have stopped on the battlefields, but the debate over the Red Terror's legacy, that's still going strong. It's not just about the numbers. It's about what it all meant. Decades later, historians are still really divided on how to interpret these awful events.
So, on one side, you have a prominent historian like Stanley G. Payne. His view is that the terror wasn't just random chaos, but a kind of semi-organized persecution that came directly from the revolutionary ideas of the far left. He argues that it was, in many ways, more irrational than the terror on the nationalist side, because it targeted innocent people who posed no actual threat, with the clergy being the perfect example. But then you have other major historians like Antony Beevor, who see it differently. They argue that the Red Terror was mainly a spontaneous explosion of rage from the people, a gut reaction of fear mixed with a deep desire for revenge for what they saw as centuries of oppression, all of it just unleashed by the military coup. Beevor makes a really interesting contrast. He calls the Red Terror a sudden and rapidly spent reaction, while describing the nationalist violence as a cold, methodical, and unrelenting purge that went on for years, even after the war was over.
In the end, the Red Terror is this really stark reminder that in a civil war, the violence is almost never just contained to the battlefield. The fact that we still have these competing stories, these deep, deep scars, it leaves us with a really tough question, one that Spain is still grappling with. How does a nation heal when its own history becomes a battlefield?